Hello everyone and welcome to the Unseen Fear channel. Story 1. It was a cold, moonless night and the world outside was eerily silent. The stillness seemed to creep into the very walls of the old Victorian house where young Eliza lived with her parents. The family had moved in just a month ago, unaware of the sinister history the house carried. Rumors whispered among the townsfolk spoke of dark shadows, restless spirits, and something far worse. Something that lurked beneath the beds of those who dared to sleep within its confines. Eliza, a curious and imaginative 11-year-old, had always been fascinated by ghost stories. Her room, with its antique furniture and a creaky wooden bed, seemed straight out of one of the tales she loved. She often joked to herself that the bed, with its dark, yawning space underneath, might hide a monster. But jokes became less amusing when, on her first night in the house, she heard faint scratching sounds coming from beneath her bed. At first, Eliza dismissed it as her imagination. Perhaps it was just the house settling or a mouse scurrying about. But the sounds persisted, growing louder and more distinct each night. By the end of the week, she could hear not just scratching, but a low, guttural growl. She told her parents, but they brushed it off, insisting she was simply having trouble adjusting to her new surroundings. One night, unable to bear the fear gnawing at her, Eliza decided to confront whatever was under her bed. Armed with a flashlight and her favorite stuffed rabbit for courage, she knelt on the floor, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Slowly, she lifted the edge of the bedspread and peered into the darkness. The beam of her flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing nothing. Just dust bunnies and the forgotten sock she had lost days ago. Relieved yet embarrassed by her own paranoia, Eliza let out a shaky laugh and crawled back into bed. But as she pulled the covers up, she froze. The scratching had stopped, replaced by a voice, barely above a whisper. "I see you." Eliza's blood ran cold. She bolted upright and looked around the room, but it was empty. Trembling, she turned off the flashlight and lay down, convincing herself she had imagined it. But the voice returned the next night, and the night after that, growing clearer and more insistent. "Come closer," it beckoned. "I have a secret to share." Her once peaceful room now felt like a prison. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, and every creak of the floorboards sent her heart racing. Desperate, Eliza devised a plan. She would set up her phone to record whatever was happening while she slept. That night, she placed the phone on her bedside table, its camera trained on the floor beneath her bed, and drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Eliza hesitated before watching the footage. Her hand shook as she pressed play. For hours, nothing happened, just her tossing and turning in bed. Then, around 3 a.m., the screen showed movement. A dark, misshapen hand emerged from under the bed, its fingers long and clawed. The hand gripped the floor and slowly a head followed. Its face was grotesque, with hollow eyes and a wide, jagged grin that seemed to split its face in two. It crawled out halfway, pausing to stare directly at the camera, as if aware it was being watched. Then it slid back under the bed with unnatural speed. Eliza screamed and dropped the phone. She ran to her parents, who finally took her seriously after seeing the footage. They called the police, but when officers arrived, there was no sign of anything unusual. The bed was moved, the floorboards were checked, and the entire room was searched. Still, the video evidence was undeniable, and the family decided it was best to leave the house. The next day, they packed their belongings and moved to a hotel while arranging to sell the house. Eliza's nightmares persisted, haunted by the creature's grin and its chilling words. "I see you." Her parents tried to reassure her, but deep down, Eliza knew the truth. Whatever it was, it hadn't been confined to the house. As they settled into the hotel that night, she heard it again, the scratching beneath her bed. Story 2. The town of Ashenridge sat on the edge of the world, or so it seemed to its residents. Encased by thick forests and rolling hills, its remoteness gave it an eerie sense of isolation. Its cobblestone streets and weathered buildings whispered stories of an older time, tales long buried in the minds of those who lived there. But one tale had never faded, the story of the fog. For decades, the townsfolk adhered to an unwritten rule: stay out of the fog. It was more than a precaution against getting lost. It was survival. The fog wasn't like the ordinary mists that rolled over the hills in the early morning. This fog was heavy, suffocating, and cold. It lingered in the forests and the lowlands like a beast waiting to pounce. Those who ventured into it often returned broken, their minds shattered by whispers only they could hear. Others never returned at all, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a deepening fear among the townsfolk. 16-year-old Clara had grown up with the stories of the fog. Her grandmother, Eleanor, was the town's unofficial historian and loved regaling Clara with tales of Ashenridge's past. But the stories of the fog were different. They carried a weight that even Eleanor's voice couldn't lighten. "The fog is alive," she would say, her weathered hands clutching a cup of tea. "It watches, it waits, and when it wants you, it takes you." Clara never believed in the supernatural. To her, the stories were just a way to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But when her younger brother Sam disappeared one misty evening, the fog became more than just a tale. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. Sam had gone to play near the woods, as he often did, while Clara stayed home studying. The sun had dipped below the horizon when their mother noticed Sam hadn't returned. Panic set in quickly, and Clara joined her parents and a group of neighbors to search for him. They combed the woods with lanterns and flashlights, their voices echoing into the growing darkness. But as the hours passed, hope began to wane. Clara's father called off the search, promising to resume in the morning. But Clara couldn't sleep. She knew where Sam had gone. She knew he was in the fog. Determined to find her brother, Clara grabbed her flashlight and snuck out of the house. The night air was crisp and carried the faint scent of pine. The fog loomed at the edge of the forest, a wall of gray that seemed almost alive. Clara hesitated for only a moment before stepping into it. The cold enveloped her immediately, chilling her to the bone. Her flashlight's beam barely pierced the dense mist, casting long, distorted shadows that danced at the edges of her vision. "Oh, Sam?" she called, her voice muffled by the fog. There was no answer, only the eerie silence that seemed to press against her ears. As she ventured deeper, the ground grew soft and spongy beneath her feet. The trees around her became indistinct shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Then she saw them, shadows darker than the fog itself, shifting and writhing as if alive. At first, Clara thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but the shadows grew bolder, darting closer and lingering longer. They had no defined form, yet their presence was palpable, a suffocating dread that made her chest tighten. Whispers began to fill the air, faint at first but growing louder with each step she took. They spoke her name, intertwining with other voices that murmured unintelligible words. Clara's heart pounded as she spun around, trying to find the source of the whispers, but the fog revealed nothing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. Sam stood motionless a few yards away, his figure barely visible through the mist. Relief and fear clashed within her as she ran toward him, calling his name. But as she got closer, she realized something was wrong. Sam's face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his body unnaturally still. When she reached out to touch him, his skin was cold and clammy, like the fog itself. "Sam?" she whispered, her voice trembling. His head turned slowly, too slowly, and a smile stretched across his face. A wide, unnatural grin that didn't belong to him. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice layered with tones that didn't match his own. Clara stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her grasp. The shadows closed in, their tendrils reaching for her, wrapping around her arms and legs. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from within her own mind. Desperation surged through Clara, and she yanked herself free, stumbling backward. She grabbed her flashlight and ran, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The shadows pursued her, their forms shifting and melding into grotesque shapes. The fog seemed endless, every direction the same. Just when she thought her legs would give out, she burst through the mist and into the clearing near her home. The world outside the fog felt unreal, The air was warmer, the sounds sharper, but Clara couldn't shake the cold grip of fear. She collapsed onto the grass, trembling and gasping for air. Her parents found her hours later, huddled on the porch with a blank stare. She tried to tell them what she had seen, but the words wouldn't come. Sam was gone, and the fog had taken him. The town mourned the loss of another child, but life went on as it always did in Ashen Ridge. The fog remained at the edge of the woods, a constant, silent reminder of the danger it posed. Clara couldn't forget, though. The whispers stayed with her, haunting her dreams and calling to her in the stillness of the night. She knew the fog wasn't done with her. It was waiting, watching, and one day it would come for her. Story 3. Nestled on the outskirts of the small, forgotten town of Hollowbrook lay the Wailing Woods, a sprawling expanse of ancient trees and overgrown paths. The townsfolk avoided it at all costs, and for good reason. Stories of the woods had circulated for generations, each more chilling than the last. They spoke of ghostly cries echoing through the trees, shadows that moved on their own, and travelers who entered but never returned. Some said the woods were cursed, others believed they were alive. No one dared venture too deep, except the desperate or the foolish. For 16-year-old Eliza Winters, the woods had always been a source of morbid fascination. She'd grown up listening to her grandmother's tales of the Wailing Woods, stories meant to frighten children into obedience. But Eliza wasn't like other children. She didn't fear the woods, she was drawn to them. Her parents, however, were strict about the unspoken rule: stay out of the woods, no matter what. It wasn't until her best friend Caleb vanished after daring to explore the outskirts that Eliza's curiosity became an obsession. Caleb's disappearance had left the town shaken. Search parties combed through the woods for weeks, their voices growing hoarse from shouting his name. But the deeper they went, the stranger the woods became. Paths that should have led out twisted back in on themselves. The air grew colder and the trees seemed to whisper in an unearthly language. Eventually the search was called off. Caleb was presumed dead, though his body was never found. Eliza refused to accept this. She was determined to find him, no matter what it took. On a moonless night, Eliza packed a small bag with supplies, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a notebook. She left a note for her parents, promising she'd be back by morning, and headed for the edge of the woods. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Her flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing twisted branches that seemed to claw at the sky. As she stepped into the forest, a shiver ran down her spine. The boundary between Hollowbrook and the Wailing Woods felt like a threshold between two worlds. The first hour of her journey was uneventful, though the oppressive silence was unnerving. But as she ventured deeper, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller and closer together, their gnarled roots snaking across the ground like veins. The air grew colder, and a faint, mournful wail echoed in the distance. It sent a chill down her spine, but she pressed on, calling out Caleb's name. The wail grew louder, almost as if it were responding to her voice. Then she saw them, figures moving between the trees, just beyond the reach of her flashlight. They were shadowy and indistinct, their forms flickering like smoke. At first she thought it might be her imagination, but the figures grew more defined as she walked. They didn't approach her but seemed to watch from a distance, their presence heavy and unsettling. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. The woods don't just take people, they keep them. Eliza's resolve wavered, but she couldn't turn back now. The wailing had grown into a chorus of voices, some sobbing, others screaming. She followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. As she pushed through a dense thicket, she stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood an enormous, ancient tree, its bark blackened and its branches twisted like skeletal arms. The air around it shimmered, and the ground was littered with items: a torn scarf, a rusted locket, a child's shoe. Caleb's backpack lay among them. Before she could react, the shadows emerged from the trees surrounding her. They were no longer vague shapes, but humanoid figures with hollow eyes and mouths, stretched wide in silent screams. One stepped forward, its bony hand pointing at the ancient tree. Eliza felt an overwhelming compulsion to approach it. As she neared the tree, she saw that its bark was etched with countless faces, their expressions frozen in agony. She realized with horror that these were the souls of those the woods had claimed. A voice whispered in her ear, low and guttural, "Leave or stay. The choice is yours." Eliza turned to find herself face to face with a figure that resembled Caleb, though his eyes were empty and his movements stiff. He reached out to her, his hand cold and clammy. "You have to go," he rasped, "before it's too late." Eliza's instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave Caleb behind. "I'm not leaving without you," she cried, gripping his hand. The shadows closed in, their whispers becoming a deafening roar. The tree's branches reached toward her, and the ground beneath her feet began to shift. Caleb shook his head. "You can't save me," he said, his voice breaking. "But you can save yourself." With tears streaming down her face, Eliza let go of Caleb's hand and ran. The shadows pursued her, their wails piercing the night. She tripped and stumbled but kept moving, the edge of the woods a distant, desperate hope. When she finally broke through the tree line, the first rays of dawn were piercing the horizon. She collapsed onto the ground, sobbing and gasping for air. The shadows stopped at the edge of the woods, retreating into the darkness. Eliza returned to Hollowbrook, but she was never the same. The woods had marked her, and the whispers stayed with her, haunting her dreams and filling her waking moments with dread. She never spoke of what she saw, but the townsfolk could see the change in her eyes. The Wailing Woods had taken Caleb, but it had let her go. For now, Story 4. In the quiet town of Black Hollow, nestled deep within a valley surrounded by jagged peaks, life was simple and uneventful. Farmers tilled the soil, shopkeepers opened their doors with the first light of dawn, and children played in the cobblestone streets. But when the autumn winds began to blow and the leaves turned to fiery hues, a shadow of unease would creep over the town. It was said that every 30 years, under the ominous glow of a blood-red moon, the town's darkest secrets would come to life. The legend of the blood moon had been passed down through generations, whispered in hushed tones by candlelight. It was said that on this night, the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, allowing vengeful spirits to roam freely. But the most chilling part of the tale was the curse. One family in Black Hollow would always pay the price. No one knew who it would be until it was too late. This year, the blood moon fell on Halloween, a coincidence that added an air of sinister excitement to the town's usual festivities. Among the townsfolk, 17-year-old Clara Monroe was the least superstitious. She had grown tired of the old stories and her mother's endless warnings. Clara longed for adventure, for something beyond the confines of Black Hollow. She often wandered the forest that bordered the town, her curiosity drawing her to places others feared to tread. As the fateful night approached, Clara noticed strange occurrences. The air grew colder than it should have for late October, and animals behaved erratically. The family's old dog Max would bark at the empty corners of the house, his hackles raised. Shadows seemed to stretch longer and move in ways they shouldn't. Clara dismissed these as coincidences, but her unease grew when she stumbled upon an ancient, weathered book in the attic while searching for Halloween decorations. The book was bound in cracked leather and filled with cryptic symbols and handwritten notes in faded ink. Its pages detailed rituals, protection spells, and the history of the blood moon curse. One entry caught Clara's attention, a passage describing a ritual to banish the spirits of the blood moon. It required rare ingredients and had to be performed at midnight beneath the blood-red moon. Intrigued, Clara decided to investigate further. If the curse was real, she reasoned, perhaps she could stop it. Her best friend Ethan reluctantly agreed to help. Unlike Clara, Ethan was a firm believer in the supernatural, having grown up on his grandmother's ghost stories. Together, they scoured the forest for the ingredients listed in the book: blackthorn branches, graveyard dirt, and a silver coin buried under the oldest tree in Black Hollow. Each step brought them closer to the truth, but it also seemed to awaken something in the woods. The trees whispered in the wind, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. By the time the blood moon rose, Clara and Ethan had gathered everything they needed. The town was eerily quiet, the usual Halloween revelry subdued by the haunting crimson glow that bathed the streets. Clara's mother begged her to stay inside, but Clara was determined. She and Ethan ventured to the old cemetery on the edge of town, the site where the ritual was to be performed. The cemetery was shrouded in mist, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows on the ancient tombstones. As they began the ritual, the air grew heavy and the temperature plummeted. Clara's voice shook as she recited the incantation from the book, her breath visible in the freezing air. The ground beneath their feet rumbled, and a low guttural growl echoed through the cemetery. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. They were not human, but twisted, ghastly apparitions with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. The spirits of the blood moon had awakened. Ethan's courage faltered, but Clara pressed on, her determination outweighing her fear. The spirits circled them, their whispers growing louder, filling the air with voices of anguish and rage. The final step of the ritual required Clara to offer a personal sacrifice. Without hesitation, she pulled a locket from around her neck, a gift from her late father, and placed it on the altar. The locket began to glow, and a blinding light erupted from it, driving back the spirits with a piercing scream. For a moment all was still, the spirits were gone, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. Clara and Ethan collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. They had done it. The curse had been broken, or so they thought. As they made their way back to town, they noticed something strange. The moon was no longer red, but the town was eerily silent. Doors hung open and windows were shattered. It was as if the entire population of Black Hollow had vanished. A chilling realization dawned on Clara. The spirits hadn't been banished. They had been unleashed. And now they were free to roam far beyond the bounds of the blood moon. Clara and Ethan's victory turned to ash as they stood at the edge of the empty town, the weight of their actions pressing heavily on their shoulders. They had tampered with forces beyond their understanding, and the consequences would haunt them forever. The blood moon had risen, and Black Hollow would never be the same again. Story 5. At the heart of the desolate countryside, where winding dirt roads gave way to untamed wilderness, stood the abandoned chapel. Weathered by centuries of neglect, its stone walls were cloaked in ivy, and its shattered stained glass windows gaped like empty eyes. The chapel had long been a source of unease for the nearby villagers, who spoke in whispers of the cursed ground on which it stood. Some claimed it was a sanctuary for the damned. Others believed it to be a portal to something far worse. For as long as anyone could remember, the chapel had been shunned. Livestock refused to graze near it, and even birds avoided its crumbling steeple. The townsfolk told tales of eerie lights flickering within its walls on moonless nights, and disembodied voices singing hymns in a language no one could recognize. Yet, for all their fear, no one dared venture close enough to confirm the stories. That is, until the arrival of Claire Hart, a young journalist with a penchant for uncovering the macabre. Claire had built her career on investigating haunted locations and unraveling urban legends. When she stumbled across a mention of the abandoned chapel in an old diary she found at a flea market, her curiosity was piqued. The diary's author, a priest named Father Elias, had written cryptically about the unspeakable tragedy that befell the chapel and warned that no soul should ever enter its cursed halls. Claire arrived in the village on a gray autumn afternoon, her car kicking up clouds of dust as she drove into the main square. The locals were wary of her questions, their eyes darting toward the horizon whenever the chapel was mentioned. Eventually, an elderly woman named Agnes broke the silence. "It's not just stories, you know," she said, her voice trembling. "The chapel, it changes people. Those who go in are never the same, if they come back at all." Ignoring the warnings, Claire set out for the chapel at dusk, armed with her camera, a flashlight, and a notebook. The path was overgrown and the air grew colder the closer she got. When the chapel finally came into view, a sense of foreboding settled over her. The dying light of the sun bathed the building in an eerie orange glow, and the surrounding trees seemed to lean toward it, as if drawn to its malevolent presence. As Claire pushed open the heavy wooden doors, a chill swept over her, and the scent of decay filled her nostrils. The interior was even more decrepit than she had imagined. Pews lay in splinters, the altar was cracked and stained, and the remains of ancient candles stood melted to their holders. Her flashlight beam caught glimpses of strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols that didn't match any religious iconography she recognized. She began to explore, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. It wasn't long before she noticed the whispers. At first they were faint, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder with every step she took. The words were indistinct, but their tone was pleading, desperate. Claire's pulse quickened as she tried to rationalize the sounds. Just the wind, she told herself, though she knew better. Her camera captured strange phenomena, orbs of light that hovered in the air, shadows that moved against the grain of her flashlight's beam. As she approached the altar, the whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. On the altar lay a book, its leather cover cracked and blackened as if scorched by fire. The title was illegible, but as Claire opened it, the temperature in the room plummeted. The pages were filled with more of the strange symbols she'd seen on the walls, along with drawings of grotesque figures that seemed to leap off the page. At the center of the book was a handwritten passage in Father Elias's spidery script. To those who seek answers, beware. The chapel hungers for souls, and its thirst can never be quenched. Before Claire could process the words, the doors slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. Her flashlight flickered, and the chapel was plunged into darkness. Panic set in as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. This time they were joined by the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing from the shadows. Claire's flashlight sputtered back to life, revealing a figure at the far end of the chapel. It was cloaked in darkness, its form indistinct, but its eyes, two burning pinpricks of red, bored into her. She stumbled backward, the book slipping from her hands and falling open on the floor. The symbols on its pages began to glow, and the air was filled with a deafening, otherworldly hum. The figure advanced, and Claire realized with dawning horror that it was not walking but gliding, its feet never touching the ground. She turned and ran, her heart pounding as the whispers rose to a cacophony. The doors, once locked, now burst open, and she stumbled out into the cold night air. Behind her, the chapel seemed to shudder, its walls pulsating as if alive. Claire didn't stop running until she reached her car. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The chapel stood silhouetted against the moonlit sky, and for a brief moment, she saw the red eyes watching her from the doorway. When she returned to the village, she was met with knowing looks and somber silence. She didn't need to explain what had happened. They already knew. In the weeks that followed, Claire tried to write about her experience, but the words wouldn't come. Her once steady hands now trembled, and nightmares plagued her sleep. The whispers had followed her home, haunting her in the dead of night. The chapel had let her go, but it had left its mark, and deep down, Claire knew that one day it would call her back. Story 6. In the small, rain-drenched town of Evermore, there was a peculiar shop tucked away in a forgotten alley. Wren's Curiosities was its name, and it specialized in rare and unusual antiques. The townsfolk, wary of its dimly lit interior and the mysterious old man who ran it, rarely ventured inside. But for those brave enough to explore its shadowy corners, they would often leave with stories of objects that seemed to hum with secrets. It was on a dreary afternoon, as thunder growled in the distance, that a young woman named Eliza stepped into the shop. She was new to Evermore, having moved there to escape the chaos of city life and to find inspiration for her artwork. Her curiosity led her into Wren's Curiosities, seeking a unique centerpiece for her studio. What she found instead was a mirror. It wasn't particularly large, nor was it adorned with intricate carvings or gold filigree. It was simple, with a weathered wooden frame, but the glass was flawless, almost unnervingly so. It reflected light in a way that seemed to make the room around it darker. Eliza was drawn to it, her own reflection staring back at her with an intensity she couldn't explain. The shopkeeper, Mr. Wren, appeared from the shadows as if summoned by her interest. "Ah, the Vesper mirror," he said, his voice raspy and low. "A fine choice, but perhaps not for everyone." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Mr. Wren hesitated, his cloudy eyes narrowing. "It has a history. Some say it reveals more than what's in front of it. Are you sure you're ready to see what lies beyond the surface?" Intrigued rather than deterred, Eliza purchased the mirror and had it delivered to her small cottage on the outskirts of town. She placed it in her studio, where its reflective surface added depth to the room. For weeks, it was nothing more than a peculiar but beautiful addition to her space. Then, the whispers began. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the faint sound of voices just beyond her hearing. She would glance around, only to find the room empty. The whispers grew louder at night, a soft murmur that seemed to emanate from the mirror. They spoke her name, calling to her, in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. One evening, unable to ignore it any longer, Eliza stood before the mirror, her hands trembling. "What do you want?" she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. The reflection stared back at her, but as she watched, it began to change, her image distorted, and the face in the mirror, her face, smiled. In a way she knew she never would. The eyes were wrong, too, gleaming with a malevolence that sent shivers down her spine. Panicked, Eliza stepped back, but the reflection didn't move with her. Instead, it leaned closer to the glass, its smile widening. "Let me out," it whispered, the words clear and cold. "I've been waiting so long." Eliza fled the studio, locking the door behind her. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, stress, or an overactive imagination. But the next morning, when she dared to return, she found the studio in disarray. Canvases were slashed, paint smeared across the walls, and the mirror stood upright, untouched, its surface gleaming as if it had been freshly cleaned. Desperate for answers, Eliza turned to the townsfolk, but they avoided her questions, their expressions darkening at the mention of Wren's curiosities or the mirror. Only Mrs. Doyle, the town's oldest resident, offered any insight. "The Vesper mirror?" she said, her voice heavy with dread. "That thing should have been destroyed long ago. It doesn't just show reflections, my dear, it shows what's trapped between worlds. And sometimes it lets them through." Eliza returned home, determined to rid herself of the cursed object. But as she approached the mirror, it seemed to pulse with life, the glass rippling like water. Her reflection, or whatever inhabited it, was waiting, its eyes burning with hatred and hunger. The lights flickered and the room grew icy cold. Eliza's reflection began to speak, recounting her deepest fears and darkest memories, things she had never told anyone. The voice grew louder, drowning out her thoughts until she screamed, grabbing a cloth to cover the mirror. But the fabric fell away, as if the mirror rejected it. Determined to end the nightmare, Eliza grabbed a hammer and swung it at the glass. The mirror shattered, shards raining down like jagged stars. For a moment, she thought it was over. But then she saw them, eyes, hundreds of them, peering out from the fragments. And from those shards, something began to emerge. The creature was formless at first, a swirling mass of shadow and light. But it soon took shape. It was her, yet not her, a grotesque mockery of her image, its features twisted with malice. It lunged at her, and she barely escaped, barricading herself in her bedroom as the thing prowled the house, its laughter echoing through the halls. By morning, the house was silent. Eliza ventured out cautiously, finding the mirror and its fragments gone. But the damage remained, claw marks on the walls, her artwork destroyed, and a lingering sense of dread that refused to fade. She left Evermore that day, abandoning her cottage and her dreams of a quiet life. Years later, the mirror reappeared in Wren's Curiosities, pristine and whole, waiting for the next unwitting soul to take it home. And in the quiet of the shop, if one listened closely, they might hear the faintest of whispers, calling a name that could be theirs. Story 7. It was an ordinary Friday evening when Claire and her family moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town. The house, with its towering ivy-clad walls and creaking floorboards, had been abandoned for years, yet it seemed to welcome them with an eerie quietness. As they unpacked, Claire's curiosity led her to the cellar door, hidden beneath a thick layer of dust at the foot of the staircase. Despite her parents' warnings not to explore, a strange compulsion tugged at her. When she finally pried open the door, the cold air hit her like a slap in the face. The smell of dampness and decay lingered as the stairs descended into an abyss of shadows. The cellar was vast and unnervingly silent, save for the faint drip of water from somewhere deep within. There were old crates scattered throughout, their contents unknown, but what drew her attention the most was an ancient-looking iron door at the far end. Its surface was rusted, and strange symbols were etched into the metal. Claire felt an overwhelming need to open it, to understand what lay beyond, but before she could reach it, a strange whispering sound filled the air. It was faint, but it called her name, beckoning her closer. Frozen with a mixture of fear and fascination, Claire reached for the door's handle. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the whispers turned to guttural growls, like something trapped and longing for release. Heart pounding, she yanked the door open. A sudden rush of cold swept over her as a shadowy figure loomed in the doorway. The figure was indistinct, a mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with life. It stepped forward, its presence suffocating the very air around her. Claire tried to scream, but her voice was stolen by the creature's overwhelming presence. Desperate to escape, she turned and fled up the stairs, but the cellar seemed to stretch endlessly. Each step felt heavier, as though the darkness was pulling her back into its grip. As she neared the top, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Claire stumbled forward into the living room, breathless and terrified. Her parents, who had been in the kitchen, turned to her with confused expressions, but when Claire tried to explain, she realized that they didn't see what she saw. The cellar was gone. The door was sealed shut, as if it had never been there at all. That night Claire lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling of something watching her. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Suddenly, a faint sound reached her ears. A whisper, soft but unmistakable. Her heart raced. The voice, the growl, it was all too familiar. "You can't escape," it murmured. Claire's eyes snapped open, but there was nothing there. Still, the whispering continued, closer now, as if the darkness beneath the cellar was stretching its tendrils into every corner of the house. And as she lay frozen in terror, Claire realized the horrible truth. Whatever was beneath the cellar had followed her, and it wasn't done with her yet. Story 8. It had been a year since Lily first heard the rumors about the old asylum on the outskirts of town. Hidden deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the world, the asylum had been abandoned for decades, its dark history buried in whispers and hushed tones. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew. The patients who once filled its halls had disappeared, the staff long gone, and the building itself seemed to be slowly sinking into the earth, as though the very foundation were being consumed by the madness that had once taken root there. Yet, despite all the warnings, Lily couldn't resist. She had to see it for herself. One cool autumn afternoon, she ventured out to the forgotten asylum. The air was thick with fog as she crossed the overgrown path leading to its decaying gates. The iron bars were rusted, twisted in strange angles, as though nature itself had tried to reclaim the place. The heavy doors creaked as she pushed them open, the sound echoing through the emptiness. A chill crawled up her spine, but her curiosity pushed her forward. The building loomed ahead, an imposing structure of crumbling stone and shattered windows, its silhouette framed by the gray sky. It was as if the place had been abandoned overnight, yet every inch of it seemed to hum with an eerie presence. Inside, the asylum was a maze of forgotten rooms and corridors. The walls were stained with age and neglect, peeling wallpaper revealing the bare, cold stone beneath. Faint traces of old bloodstains marked the floors, the remnants of past horrors long since wiped away, but never forgotten. Lily walked cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She passed through long hallways lined with broken doors, each one leading to rooms that seemed to hold their own dark secrets. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the further she ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Suddenly she heard something. A faint shuffle of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to calm her racing heart. It must have been her imagination, but as she turned to continue down the corridor, she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, its form obscured in the shadowy darkness. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its face was hidden by a tattered, blood-stained mask. Lily's stomach churned as the figure began to move toward her, its steps slow and deliberate, as though it were savoring each one. Frozen in place, Lily's mind raced. The asylum had been closed for so long. How could anyone still be here? As the figure drew closer, she saw something else. Strange markings carved into the walls, symbols she couldn't understand, and old, torn medical records scattered on the floor. The closer she got to the figure, the more oppressive the air became. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating her, pushing her to the brink of insanity. The figure's footsteps grew louder, more frantic, and just as it reached her, it stopped, standing perfectly still, like a statue. A cold, sinister voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come." Lily's blood ran cold as she backed away, but the figure did not move. It simply stood there, watching her with empty eyes that seemed to pierce through her soul. As her mind reeled, a sense of dread washed over her. She felt as though the very essence of the asylum was alive, aware of her presence, and hungry for her. She turned to run, but the hallways twisted and warped before her eyes, the walls closing in, the once clear path now an endless labyrinth of doors and shadows. She could hear the soft whispers now, low and guttural, coming from all around her. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in her ears, repeating over and over again, until they became a chant. Her legs trembled as she sprinted down one hallway after another, her breath ragged and shallow, but no matter how fast she ran, the walls seemed to stretch further, the asylum never ending. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent, until they became shrill, like the wailing of the lost souls who had once filled the asylum. Suddenly she stumbled into a room, its door slamming shut behind her. The room was small and barren, save for a single rusted chair in the center. The air was thick, suffocating, and as she backed into the corner, she noticed something on the walls. Blood, thick and dark, had been smeared across the stone, forming grotesque symbols and faces that seemed to shift and twist in the dim light. Her heart pounded as she reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the asylum itself was holding her prisoner. A low, rasping laugh echoed through the room. "You're not leaving," the voice said, its tone dripping with malice. None of them left. Lily's pulse raced as the walls seemed to close in around her, the room growing colder, darker. Shadows began to crawl along the floor, reaching out for her. She screamed and clawed at the door, but it was useless. Her hands slipped in the thickening darkness as the walls began to pulse, as if the asylum itself were breathing. She turned and saw the figure again, standing in the doorway, its face now revealed. The mask had fallen away, revealing a twisted, mangled face, half decayed, with hollow eyes and a grotesque grin that stretched too wide, far beyond what should have been possible. The figure stepped into the room, and as it did, the shadows seemed to swallow it whole, leaving only its malicious grin behind. Lily stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows wrapped around her, pulling her toward the center of the room, where the chair awaited her like a throne for the damned. In the final moments of her consciousness, Lily realized the truth. The asylum had never been abandoned. It had never let go of its residents, its patients. The asylum was alive, and it was always hungry for more souls to claim. As she was consumed by the darkness, she understood that no one ever truly left the forgotten asylum. They simply became a part of its twisted, eternal nightmare. And in the silence that followed, the asylum waited, patient and eternal, for the next soul to wander through its gates. Story 9. It was the summer of 1952 when Ellie first heard the rumors about the Crimson Lake. Located deep in the heart of the forest, hidden away from the well-worn paths of the small town of Ashford, the lake was infamous for its dark history. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously whenever the subject came up. They said the water was never truly clear, always tinted with a deep red hue, even in the hottest days of summer. Some believed it was the reflection of the setting sun, but those who had ventured too close, or worse, into its depths, never returned the same, if they returned at all. As a child, Ellie had listened to these stories, but they had always seemed like little more than folklore, cautionary tales to keep children away from the forbidden places. However, as she grew older, Ellie's curiosity about the lake grew, and the darkness surrounding it began to beckon her. On her 18th birthday, Ellie decided she would uncover the truth for herself. Armed with nothing but her determination and a backpack filled with supplies, she set off into the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as she ventured deeper into the woods, following the narrow trail that had once been a well-traveled path but was now overgrown with vines and fallen branches. The deeper she went, the quieter the forest became, the rustling of the wind through the trees fading into an oppressive stillness. There was no bird song, no scurrying of animals. It felt as if the very woods were holding their breath. After hours of hiking, Ellie finally arrived at the lake's edge. The sight of it stole her breath. The water was an unsettling shade of deep red, as though it had been stained by something far darker than any natural occurrence. The surface shimmered, though it was not the pleasant gleam of sunlight on water. Instead, it gave off an unnatural, almost sinister gleam, like a pool of blood under a dim light. Ellie hesitated, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, but the pull of the lake was irresistible. She slowly approached the water, the ground beneath her feet soft with wet moss and earth. Her eyes lingered on the crimson surface, trying to make sense of it, but it was as if the lake itself was looking back at her, alive, watching. A sudden chill swept through the air, and Ellie shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. The lake seemed to ripple, though there was no breeze. She knelt at the edge, her fingers brushing the water's surface, and a strange sensation washed over her. Cold, like death itself. The moment her fingers made contact, the water seemed to grasp her, pulling her in, as though the lake itself was alive. Her heart raced, but she yanked her hand back, stumbling away from the shore. As she did, a loud splash echoed across the lake, sending a jolt of terror through her. Her eyes darted around, but she saw nothing. Then, something in the water caught her attention. Movement. Slow, deliberate, almost graceful. Something was rising from the depths. Her pulse quickened, and her breath caught in her throat as the figure emerged from the lake. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a shadow, an indistinct shape in the red-tinged water, but as it came closer, Ellie realized it was a person. A man, or what had once been a man. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes wide and empty, hollow pits that seemed to stare straight into her soul. His hair was matted with algae and dark strands of something else, something that seemed to glisten like oil in the water. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a low, guttural sound rumbled from deep within his chest. Ellie stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the wet ground. She was terrified, but something kept her rooted to the spot, her gaze locked on the figure as he slowly pulled himself from the water. The closer he got, the more Ellie could see the true horror of his form, the ragged, torn clothing clinging to his skeletal frame, the fingers elongated and twisted like the roots of an ancient tree. His skin, pale and decayed, was covered in dark, unnatural veins that pulsed with an eerie light, as if something within him still lived. The man, or whatever he was, stopped a few feet from Ellie, his eyes never leaving hers. A soft whisper seemed to come from the depths of the lake, a voice that echoed in her mind, not through her ears. "You shouldn't have come," it murmured, its voice dry and rasping. "The lake is never what it seems." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest, but her legs refused to move. The figure raised a hand, and as he did, the water around him swirled, as if it were alive, responding to his every movement. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and Ellie stumbled, falling to her knees. The figure reached out, his hand now inches from her face, and in that moment, Ellie saw the truth. His eyes were not hollow, but filled with the same crimson hue as the lake. He was a part of it, an extension of the horror that resided beneath the surface. Suddenly, the air seemed to grow even colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Ellie's breath came out in white clouds. The lake seemed to rise, as if answering an unspoken call, the crimson water swirling and churning, reaching out toward her. She could hear the faint sound of whispers now, hundreds, thousands of voices, all murmuring in unison, urging her to come closer, to join them in the depths of the lake. In a desperate panic, Ellie scrambled backward, but her foot caught on a rock, sending her tumbling into the water. She gasped, the cold liquid enveloping her, and as she struggled to pull herself up, she felt something grab her ankle. Strong, unyielding, like the grip of death itself. The figure in the water watched her, his twisted grin widening, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "No!" Ellie screamed, thrashing violently in the water, but it was no use. The lake pulled her down, deeper and deeper, until the surface was nothing but a distant memory. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the crimson glow of the water, and the faces of those who had vanished before her. Lost souls who now belonged to the lake. The next morning, when the townspeople went to the lake's edge, they found nothing but the ripple of the water, calm and still, as if nothing had happened. But in the depths of the crimson lake, Ellie's body, along with the others, was lost forever, trapped in the blood-red abyss. And the whispers, the voices, continued, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to venture too close. The lake was alive, and it was hungry. Story 10. The House of Echoes had stood at the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember. With its tall, crumbling stone walls, darkened windows, and sagging roof, it seemed to belong more to the past than to the present. The house was surrounded by a dense forest, casting an eerie shadow over the nearby village. For years it had been abandoned, shrouded in stories that seemed too fantastical to be true, yet too numerous to ignore. Children were warned never to go near it, and the adults spoke of it only in whispers. They called it the House of Echoes, not because of its empty halls, but because of the strange, inexplicable sounds that seemed to emanate from within its walls at night. A series of muffled voices, faint whispers, and echoes of long-forgotten conversations. The house, they said, had a way of drawing you in, luring you with its silence until it spoke, and when it did, it never let you go. As a child, Sarah had heard the stories, but they had never scared her. She was a curious soul, always eager to uncover the truth behind the tales. Now, as an adult, she was determined to confront the mystery of the House of Echoes. She had moved back to her childhood town after the death of her parents, seeking solace in the familiar landscape. But the house remained a constant enigma. It had called to her then, and it called to her now. On a warm summer afternoon, driven by an overpowering sense of both dread and curiosity, Sarah set out toward the house, her footsteps steady and her heart pounding in her chest. The moment she crossed the threshold of the crumbling gate, she felt it, the weight of the place, an oppressive heaviness in the air that seemed to press down on her chest. The house was more imposing up close, its decay far more apparent than from a distance. The windows, once elegant, were now shattered or boarded up, and the doors hung crooked on their hinges, as if the house had been left to rot in a state of suspended animation. Despite its dilapidated state, there was something oddly inviting about it, as if it were calling her, beckoning her to enter. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but the compulsion was too strong. She pushed open the front door with a loud creak, the sound reverberating through the empty halls like a warning. Inside, the house was shrouded in darkness, the only light filtering through the cracks in the walls and ceiling. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight, and the air smelled musty, like forgotten things left to decay. The silence was deafening, the kind of quiet that made you feel as though you were being watched. As Sarah moved deeper into the house, the floors groaned under her weight, the old wood complaining at every step. Her eyes darted around, taking in the remnants of a long-forgotten life, faded wallpaper, rotting furniture, and broken picture frames. But it was the silence that unnerved her the most. There was no sound of wind outside, no birds or animals. The house felt sealed off from the world, isolated in time, and then, from the depths of the house came the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the creaking of the floorboards, but it was there, a whisper, a voice, so soft and distant that Sarah almost thought she had imagined it. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained to hear it again. It was as though someone was speaking from another room, but the words were indistinct, a jumble of sounds that made no sense. She turned to leave, but stopped herself. The house felt alive, its presence palpable, its walls vibrating with the echo of 1,000 untold stories. She had to know what it was. Following the sound, Sarah moved deeper into the heart of the house. The air grew colder as she passed through the grand hallway, the once beautiful staircase now twisted and broken. Her footsteps seemed to echo in time with the whispering voices, a strange harmony that made her skin crawl. As she reached the end of the hallway, she came upon a door. Closed, but not locked. The whispering grew louder, now mixed with strange laughter, a deep, guttural sound that made Sarah's stomach twist. She pushed the door open, and as she did, the temperature dropped sharply. The room beyond was large, its walls lined with bookshelves and covered in layers of dust. But it was the center of the room that caught her attention. A grand, full-length mirror that stood against the wall, its frame intricately carved with patterns she couldn't recognize. The mirror was covered in a thin layer of grime, but as Sarah stepped closer, she could see her reflection, a woman standing alone in a dusty, forgotten room. But as she stared into the glass, the image of herself began to shift. Her reflection twisted, her face contorting into something monstrous, her features warped and distorted, as though the glass was pulling her into another world. Her heart raced as the voices in the house grew louder, filling her mind with a cacophony of unintelligible words. The mirror began to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and Sarah reached out instinctively, drawn toward it. The moment her fingers touched the glass, everything changed. The room around her seemed to collapse into darkness. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting glimpses of another world, one filled with twisted versions of herself and figures she couldn't recognize. The echoes of the house intensified, becoming deafening, as though the walls themselves were screaming. Sarah tried to pull away, but something gripped her, cold and invisible, holding her in place. She was no longer alone in the room. There were shadows, dark figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, their faces contorted in pain and rage, their eyes fixed on her. And in that moment, Sarah realized the terrible truth. The house was not just a house, it was a prison, a place where echoes of the past were trapped, their voices forever reverberating through the walls. The mirror was a portal, a doorway into another realm, where the lost souls of the house had been bound for eternity, and Sarah had unwittingly become one of them. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The house of echoes had claimed her, and as she was pulled into the darkness, she became yet another voice, trapped in its eternal cycle. The mirror, now shattered and broken, reflected nothing but the emptiness, its surface once again smooth and silent. The house fell into quiet once more, awaiting the next unwitting soul to venture inside. And somewhere, deep within its walls, the whispers continued, louder, more insistent, waiting for the next echo to answer their call.